Hey everyone, welcome to Unbearable 73. This is my review of Masters of the Air Part 9. A couple days late, but okay, we're getting there. So this is the final episode. It's going to wrap up storylines. It's a long episode. It's over an hour in terms of run length, like an hour and 17 minutes technically, but the last 5 of that's credits. So I formed my final opinion of this series probably after the 5th episode. I knew what I was getting. I understood where it was going, and I'm okay with that. It's not as good as Band of Brothers. It's about as good as the Pacific in terms of overall, content. I mean, the production's awesome. Don't get me wrong. All 3 series, Band of Brothers, the Pacific, and Masters of the Air, are all like 10 out of 10s in terms of production value. So there's no question on that sort of stuff, right? Issue you're going to run into is, the content, right? And I thought for the Pacific and for Masters of the Air, the content in the show was less gripping, that's the wrong word, less qualitative than it was for Band of Brothers. And yes, I do have a bias towards Band of Brothers because my grandfather essentially followed a similar path, and although he didn't go north with the bulge, he went southerly, so to speak. And technically I have a cultural connection to the Pacific with John Basilone, okay? Who was an Italian-American icon. So I don't want to, I'm not trying to downplay the Pacific or Masters of the Air. I think Masters of the Air could have been done better if they had done more of the military campaign aspects that you saw in Band of Brothers, and to a lesser extent in the Pacific. Okay, basically you saw mission planning in the Masters of the Air, and that's about all the extent you got of what was actually going on with what they were doing. Well, whereas in Band of Brothers, you got an idea from the episodes exactly kind of where they were, what was going on in the war, how they were, how their company was interacting with that aspect of the war, and you lived that aspect of the war, regardless of what it was, through those men. Whereas here, you did get that when they were in the prison camps. So that was a big improvement. They did the prison camps better than I thought they would when I saw them coming after episode 5, right? I thought they were just going to do like a TV show version of The Great Escape, for example, and that's it. But no, they showed how the prisoners had to self-organize to keep the men under control, to avoid punitive measures from the Germans and all that. And in previous episodes, I've gone on about that. So I have a lot of links for this episode, all right, that take all chunks of it and give maybe longer explanations of what was going on and why certain things were where they were, right? So one thing to understand, right, is, and the reason I chose a thumbnail that I did, right, rather than, I had a choice. 2 obvious thumbnails stuck out to me. Sorry for the yawn, guys. It's either the one I chose or from the end when all the planes are flying home. And I was thinking, do I want to, have a happy note and it's over, World War II's over, blah, 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 or do I want to just sort of the horror of what went on, why World War II had to be fought. And I went with the former for a couple of reasons. We apparently live in a modern world where people just don't understand the scope of war. They don't, I'm trying not to make this relevant, but October 7th, if I recall the date correctly, when Hamas essentially mass murdered all those innocent civilians, and that generated a war, a horrible thing, essentially, between Israel and Hamas. Now, I oppose war in general, but what were people expecting when you tolerate Hamas, who basically is like the SS? Okay, they exist for one particular reason. In Hamas is just to kill the Jews. This way, the SS exists for one particular reason. Okay, to kill the enemies of the National Socialists, the socialists who we call the Nazis, to purge them. I have a link below from the National Holocaust Museum, which shows all the different groups that they purged. They weren't just purging Jews. They purged 1.6 million Polish Catholics. That's how they tested out the concentration camps in Poland. They purged the Romani peoples, who people colloquially called gypsies. They purged people, homosexuals, bisexuals, and people with alternative lifestyles. They purged German political dissenters. They purged political opposition. And these are things Hamas does. And I'm not trying to make it irrelevant, but it's like people don't want to see the horrors of what's going on there and expect the people being attacked just to roll over, right? So we've seen in this, they've sort of loosely approached that the Allies have to do some pretty, heavy things. We'll get to the quote about Nietzsche in the episode. Basically, it's, be careful how long I'm paraphrasing. Those who fight monsters often become monsters. Be careful how it gave into the abyss because it gazes back to you. And I paraphrase that, obviously. It's from Friedrich Nietzsche. And it does that. Horrible things expose you to horror and damage your soul. It's that way it is. Now, I'm not trying to turn this into a massive philosophical rant. I've been going on for 6 minutes about this. But that has to be put into perspective when we're talking about World War II. What was the cause of World War II? Well, ultimately, it was World War I. And in the aftermath of World War I, certain world leaders, like, for example, the American president, was it Wilson at the time, or Churchill, they did not want to engage in punitive retaliation against Germany. They wanted to build the German economy up, make them part of the world again, prevent the isolation that had led. The isolation and antagonism was all economic. Because war is always fought, to quote Clara von Clausewitz, politics is the continuation of war by non-military means. What is politics? Politics is how you regulate society, which includes economics, religion, and all that sort of stuff. And so what led into World War I, the several leaders like Churchill and Wilson, they wanted to prevent from happening so there wouldn't be a World War II, right? Well, no one listened. The people who took over England and the people in France and other members of Europe, even rival American political groups, they wanted to punish Germany. And while they punished Germany, what did I get? They got World War II, which was even bigger, a bigger death and impact, And the question is, did we learn our lesson? Okay, that's the important takeaway from any of these big wars. Okay, did we learn our lesson as a society? Because those who do not know history are doomed to repeat it. So without that, I have a whole bunch of links below, with some of the important parts of this detail, and let's get into the episode. So February 3rd, 1945. So we basically, gone over about 2.5 years of time in the show. When we get to the end of the episode, which skips a little bit. Beautiful opening shot. And this is a case now. So sky's overwritten, right? So when you see the amount of planes here, so early in the war, right? And I have links for this earlier higher up in the list, right? The Germans had a technological advantage, right? But they did not have a production advantage. They had it over the rest of Europe because Germany was the most advanced technological and industrial nation in Europe. But they didn't have it over the U.S. The U.S. had an untapped base. And so the U.S. started providing supplies to England, to Russia, and to China. And that's how, with our massive production base, which was unassailable. Fortress America, we had two coasts, friendly country, north and south, and all that sort of stuff. And which was the Schweinfurt Harbor. That's a whole other thing. So by the end of the war, we had begun to catch up technologically, like the P-51, for example. But what got us to early, where we were able to produce 3 or 4 tanks for every German one. By now, our ability to outproduce the Germans was taking effect. Okay, it was having an impact, and that's kind of what this image means to me. So, was bailing out of the plane. So we'll get to the first kind of moment here. So what he's trying to do is they just if you follow the progress of the war, essentially the Soviet forces. People say the Russians. It's the Soviets, and because it wasn't just Russians. It was all the other Soviet states they had begun to take over and form at the time. Although the Soviet Union got a little bigger after the war with absorption of parts of Germany and all that. So they're more properly referred to as the Soviets. Okay, so the Soviets, which were primarily Russian, not always, were advancing from the east towards the German territories, and the Allies were advancing towards the west. Okay, and I believe the episode rightly, by the way, refers to the Soviet command as opposed to the Russian command. In any case, and so the pincer effects were beginning to have its effect. So they were in this case, they were doing a bombing run over German area, but they didn't want to land in the German area because they basically would be shot. They mentioned General Yodel, and I'll put a link to him below because General Yodel, JODL, he was by this time he was the commander of the German army. Basically, there was several different German military structures. I have the links to several of them below. The main one was like the German army. Then you had the SS, which were the Nazis' particular armed forces. Then you had these militias that they formed. You've heard of the Hitler Youth. The Hitler Youth was one of the militias that they formed. You'll actually see the Hitler Youth in this episode twice, I think. They had like the Hitler Youth, which were boys, and then they had like the Hitler's young women's group. But there were several others. And those militias were formed up at the end to fortify the homeland, as it were. And they're all conscripts, okay? Although, let's understand, even those fighting the war, the German army, the U.S. army, at this time they were mostly conscripts. And that's a complex situation. I'm not justifying anyone, but these are all regular people, poor people, middle-class people, caught up in fighting wars that their leaders either started or couldn't peacefully get their way out of. And that's the important thing to remember, even in the modern context. All of us who are middle class or lower, because we're the majority of the people in terms of volume, we're serving in these wars, yet the ones starting the wars or the ones ending the wars or the ones profiting off the wars are not us. Okay? So just bear that in mind. And anyway, landing in German territory, it had gotten to the point, and that's why I linked to Yodel. Do you remember how I said at the beginning there was controversy over the strategic bombing and all that? Again, not saying the Germans were right, and ultimately the victory go the spoils. Yodel was executed for it, but there was retaliation on parts of the German peoples for what the Allies were doing. Right? We talked about the Russelheim Massacre, for example, and now Jodl issued an order called the Commando Order, where the Germans stopped taking prisoners. Basically, like if anyone was caught behind enemy lines, even wearing a uniform trying to surrender, they were being shot rather than be taken prisoner which should have been under the Geneva Conventions. Okay, and there was another order as well related to that, which had to do with partisans or something like that. But so this war is getting into the horrible parts of war, and that's why they did not want to land. I wish they had mentioned that sort of stuff. I mean, I know I'm more of an in-depth on this, and it gets there's so much to decompress from these episodes. I know they're basically a single season. I know, I'm not like a historian or scholar who wants to spend all day reading about this stuff or whatever, but I think there's more nuance that they could have put. You got the impression when you watched Band of Brothers, you kind of got an idea what was going on. They were showing you what the guys were experiencing, right? Well, here you get, they don't want to be land in Germany. He wants to land behind the Soviet lines, but why? There should have been some sort of they should have had a scene. If they put 100, have a briefing scene where they say, "Men, you blah blah. The commando order has been issued by Yodel. Blah blah blah. You don't want to be caught behind the German lines. Try to land on if you can't return to Allied lines, you have to crash. Try to crash on the Soviet side, or or don't surrender, try to sneak your way back, something. They should have had a briefing to explain, why he's doing this. That's my biggest criticism of this particular scene. The sequence, I should say. So he's down. Now he's landed behind the Soviet lines, and you'll see what's going on here. You'll see he's going to witness. So taking prisoners, so they're not even accepting, the Soviets aren't accepting prisoners. Now you might ask, why is that? Is that ethical? Nope, those are war crimes, okay? They're not endangering the men, they're clearly surrendering. And it wasn't just the Soviets, the Allies did that too. I told this story before, and I'll tell it again. So, of course, we'll see Hitler Youth here, right? Those poor kids who were freaking programmed. Well, my grandfather was in World War II. He was in a scouting company, basically. And they would advance ahead. They're one of, I think he said, 3 companies that would advance ahead of his particular army group, if that's what it was called. And the idea was to find routes and pass their way through. And then, they had their good times. Like the general or the colonel who led his area told my grandfather's troops, "We're not going to go anywhere you guys go," because my grandfather's troops, after they scouted, always made sure of finding all of the old wine cellars and whatever, so there'll be tons of booze for the soldiers coming through. So the colonel or the general's like, "We're not going to go where those guys are going," But that's a positive story. The negative story was they would constantly come, as they were clearing their way through, they'd come across German gun emplacements, right? Defensive fortifications, not big ones, but little like little bunkers or whatever. And when they found the ones with the German soldiers, my grandfather always distinguished between the German military and the Nazis. Okay, and he's a very bitter man. So if it's a bitter man who hates the enemy, okay, but he always distinguished. He said that when they came across the German soldiers, in the bunker and they retreated or they surrendered, right? But when they came across Nazis, the actual Nazis, what they would do is, if they had Hitler Youth especially, they would chain them to machine guns and basically leave them there defending with the machine guns while the adult German SS guys retreated. Okay? And my grandfather and his guys had to kill 12 to 15-year-olds, boys, essentially. And these were all young men who were fathers in some cases. And once that started happening, they're all dead, so let's say this, my grandfather and his company would never accept Nazi surrenders for the entire rest of the duration of the war. If you wore that uniform, you could be surrendering and you would be shot, okay? Because of what they went through with those bunkers and having to kill those little kids because they were shooting guns at them. They had it, So that being said, the danger of trying to surrender properly now rears your ugly head, and the atrocities that not so much the German. This is why my grandfather again, the German military was professional, and we saw that with the prisoner camps. When the German military was running them, they were trying to maintain order, keep it clean and fed. And not that they were great conditions, but they were doing the best they could to obey the Geneva Conventions and the strictures of war. Okay, when the SS came in, they would retaliate by executing prisoners. They would engage in violent interrogations and so forth. And the Allies got it bad. The Soviets got it worse. Okay, and at this point, the Soviets had pretty much said no prisoners. Plus, there was the whole communist versus socialist thing going on, where the Soviets, if you look on that list of Holocaust victims, that's right. Yodel gave the commissar order. Any of the political officers with the Soviet army would be executed without even taking the prisoners. So, if a Soviet company surrendered, there was a political officer, they would just be shot. That was a communist officer that was accompanied many troops, and without getting into the whole socialists are anyway. So he has to do his best to try to surrender to the Soviets, and things worked out for him as we saw. And it's all important to remember with the Cold War, it was the Soviet government that was the enemy, and the economics of communism that was the danger. It was not the Russians or the Kazakhstani or all the other peoples living there. They were just regular people trying to live their lives, and their descendants are the same regular people who live in Russia today. In terms of the Russians, right? So don't blame regular people for what governments do. Is what I'm kind of getting, unless it's, well, in general, don't. It's a bad high habit to get into. Okay, so what's happening here, and again, this show doesn't explain it, okay? So we're at the point of the war where the German government is discombobulating itself. There were some suicides. There were, like, you've heard about the plot to kill Hitler and all that, where several different German generals tried to have Hitler killed, and where the German military, realizing they were getting screwed because they found out about the concentration camps, started to sort of purge the Nazis. Where my grandfather himself suffered his disability, the bridge at Remagen, and I have, I know I have links to it higher in the list, but that battle where there were several German brigades or whatever army groups that were engaging in retreat, and it was surrounded by allies, and it was basically one way to cross the river, the Remagen, and the German military wanted to hold the bridge if they could, and at the very least get all the German troops across, then blow the bridge. Initially, German high command, which the Nazi command, kind of favored that because they wanted those troops. But then, as the war got desperate and they didn't want the Allies to get in, take control of the bridge, the Nazis came along and said, no, blow the bridge, screw those 100,000 troops. And that became a sort of mini civil war on that bridge between the German soldiery, the German military, and the Nazis, as there was not overt like fighting, but there was some blatant retaliation. And meanwhile, while that was occurring, the bridge was taken by the Allies, and the Germans took it back, and the Allies took it back. Went back and forth a couple of times. My grandfather was hit on the advancing side of one of the attempts to take the bridge by artillery, and that's what that was. And he was at that point in the war, he was the only man of his who came in on his company on D-Day on Normandy in the second wave who survived the entirety of World War II. Okay, so he was out of the war then, and so what was happening at that point was the German command structure was beginning to break down. All the different, as the homeland was being threatened, as the families of the soldiers were now under direct threat, and the soldier and high command of the German military were being punished and being executed by the Nazis because they couldn't win the war. They were fighting to the best of their German abilities. It just started breaking down. So several of the different factions wanted to have different outcomes. The Nazis wanted to try to I'm trying to explain this to it just out of my memory. I want to say there were at least 5 different factions for the outcomes. There were the fight to the end guys, who were all Nazis. Then there were the 7 of the Nazis who wanted to try to surrender and get a political solution to maintain their power. Then there was the German political sphere, so to speak, which were basically their economic leaders who just wanted to go over with at this point. Then you had the German military who wanted to negotiate a settlement and wanted to end it on best terms they can get, and they knew they had to preserve these prisoners. That they need to keep them, but they had to preserve them. And this is where at the time the Nazis who wanted to survive the war, not the ones who wanted to fight to the end, agreed with them that these prisoners are for differing reasons. The German military knew that if these prisoners died basically in their hands, there'd be no mercy, and the Nazis wanted to maintain them to negotiate as part of negotiations. So that this series of retreats, like they'll mention Stalag 8, that they were showing these guys at Stalag 8 several times. There are actually like multiple Stalag 8s, like Stalag 8A, 8B, 8C. I think there were at least 6 of them. I have a link to talking about some of that. And would take the prisoners and retreat, and then they showed Nuremberg, and Nuremberg obviously was where a lot of the atrocities happened. That's where I took my picture from, so that's when some of the German military and the prisoners first really found out that the Holocaust was occurring, as they were led through the same sort of camps that the poor people being purged were held at. It's a lot of history in there that's really cool stuff. Not cool that happened, but in-depth stuff that should be read, And so that was what we saw. The taking the prisoners and pulling them back through the various layers of prisoner camps, and as they got to the ones that were further and further behind the German lines, they were put in larger and larger groups in these camps. So at one point when they finally get to Stalag 7, which I think they actually showed as Stalag 7A, finally, they put the A on there. But there are, again, multiple Stalag 7s. That's called the Liberation of Mossberg, and I have some links to that as well. And if I remember correctly, don't quote me directly, Stalag 7A had like a couple 100,000 prisoners, of which 110 or 20,000 were Americans, 40 or 50,000 were Russians, and there were small groups of every other Tunisian. You'll see Tunisians there. You'll see prisoners of all different sorts in this camp. Okay. And now they're being told the Allies. So they're trying to retreat ahead of the Allies' line. Okay. And this is the truth. So what is this scene? So there was a thing happening when now they're so far behind friendly lines that the soldiers who come up newly from the States no longer are directly experiencing the war. Now, I hate to say this, but these were the time when a lot of the wealthy people's kids or the pampered people's kids got in, was finally made it to the war. But there were a lot of wealthy people's families who fought bravely. So I'm not. But the point is, these replacements were not the initial conscripts who and early volunteers, but the later ones, and they had no direct experience of the war, so it wasn't prioritized to them. So that's what this scene is conveying. So now going to Moscow at Stalag Luft 3. Now, if I want to say, Stalag Luft 3 was commanded by actual Nazis, the SS. They had taken it over after some escape attempts. And this is a scene, this is the German military, the professional military, okay, who you can see they're tired, they don't want to fight this war anymore. They're done mentally. And it got to that point where you can make an argument the German military never really wanted to start the war. It was always obvious, but it's always that way. It's always the politicians who start these wars. So now he's with the Soviet command. That's what all the red is. He's probably sitting in the car where both the colonel is and the political officer will be in that car with him. And of course, this is the first introduction in here to the concentration camps. Now, this is way broader to discuss. Obviously, this horrible evil, what the socialists did here, and the Soviets. Stalin did it twice, I think. What Mao did, killed 50 million people, and it was 2 genocides. It's kind of weird. Like, on one hand, the SS wanted to cover up the crimes, even though they were proud of doing it. by basically incinerating all the remains, and that's what they were. That a lot of times they'd find half burnt remains or whatever in some of these concentration camps. On the other hand, they kept ridiculously meticulous records of who they murdered. Okay, which records often which started before the war, when they began othering people and tracking their locations and things like that. You know, kind of like how the governments want to do now with social media tracking of people. But hey, well, you know. But obviously, we had to have this scene for. I'm not sure if this character himself ever, in real life ever made it to that point where he's looking now. But again, this is a good dramatization. It gets that they're showing you with the character experience, not just telling you. And now they're conveying to you. A lot of this episode is conveying to you the horrors of what was being done in war. But in war, and my one objection to this is, I'm not saying moral equivalency, but you know what the Allies did with strategic bombing, like when they blew up the church full of civilian workers, in the third or fourth episode or whatever, you know, which led to the Germans escalating. Which again, not justifying it. The point is, war is horrible. Okay, we do not need to see this scene to know that war is horrible. And I thought this whole sequence, when we got the message with the Holocaust, that was good. And then we already have been conveyed that, like the scene with the bombings, where we saw the guy kept pulling his baby out of the bombed out buildings and all that. We got that message conveyed. I think this is piling on a little bit. I don't know, you know. Again, this is the whole troops, Lamar. Now, so the most infamous World War II event is called the Bataan Death March, which occurred in the Pacific. But these were colloquially referred to as death marches, where the prisoners were led from camp to camp in bitter conditions, and a lot of the guys died on the trip. Some from trying to escape and being shot, but a lot of them just because they couldn't physically make the trip and just died. And this is a truism, right? Because the German troops with the group know that, yeah, they have guns, but there's less of them, and basically all of them would die, and like a lot of the prisoners would die, and so they're trying to maintain the peace. And the reason this works is because these are not SS; these are German military, who for the most part have been treating the prisoners within the bounds of the rules of war. So this is when three of our main characters made their escape. You know, and then of course now we encounter the Hitler Youth. So they're patrolling the countryside, you know, and these are little kids, and this is my, you know, told you my grandfather's story about this. You know, these kids have been indoctrinated since they were small children into this mentality, and it's like it's a horror show. As a soldier, I would not want to live. I guess the modern soldiers experiencing the kids, the indoctrinated children, say in the Middle East or whatever, you know, it's a horror show to have to deal with as a soldier. By the way, the thing about the ammunition, that was true. There were shortages of ammunition and supplies of all sorts. So when these militias were being put into the field, not just Hitler Youth, but the other ones, the only real source of supplies was the German military, which was trying to maintain them for the defense of the homeland, so to speak. And they were very not. They didn't share a lot with the militias that were running, which the Nazis had basically all called up to protect the homeland. So this is when they finally get to, I think it was Stalag 7. Stalag 7. Again, that's Stalag 7 in Musburg, but there's multiple. There's Stalag 7, A, B, C, and D. They're all separate camps. They're not like next to each other. They're all way spread out, okay? And these camps have to be put in a place where legally there's access to water, where the sewage can be drained off into ditches that go into the river and also that sort of stuff. So that's why there'd be more than one of them. Obviously, they're focusing on Musburg and Stalag 7A, which is this is 7A, because of the liberation of Musburg, as the battle was called. So they arrive, and at this point, the German military is just just whatever, just go up. They don't want inventory. They just want the war over with, and they're being told to keep these prisoners. Now there are some Nazis among them. So now what's happening here, and I have two articles about the battle of the liberation of Musburg for you. So they're at the point where chunks of the German military are beginning to surrender en masse. Like rather than fight to the death and they can't retreat, they are they're ignoring German high command and they're just surrendering where they are. Okay. So there were ongoing negotiations between the Allies and the Soviets and the regional Germans here, and that's going on at this time. And when they break down, they were told, if you don't do it, we're gonna invade. Okay, and that's what this attack is. And this is over a much longer period of time, a few weeks or months, but they sort of compressed it into like a couple of hours, basically here. Now I don't know if this really happened. With the prisoners raising the American flag, but great dramatization. Patton was here. I'm surprised they didn't have someone playing Patton for this. You get a big name actor like Tom Selleck will come in as Patton or whatever, because Patton's forces were one of the ones that liberated these camps. He was one of the commanding generals. So now the next thing they show here is the Allied response to the Dutch famine of 1944 to 1945. Now remember I said that sections of the German military, which were occupational, were either negotiating surrender or basically standing down. And so this Dutch famine had been going on for quite a while. And it started before even this point. And so they mentioned the truce that they negotiated with the local German forces not to shoot at these planes, and the planes would not attempt to bomb. Obviously, they'd be dropping food or whatever. And they show one, but there's a multitude of these plane food drops. Now, there were some local German troops who did fire on the planes, either because they was, like, for example, Nazis SS troopers who refused, or because they didn't get command, or because they were so embittered by the war. So it wasn't all like just no one got shot down or whatever. But for the most part, these missions were fairly safe. And we're at the point in the war when it's mostly over, but for the taking of Germany, so the Allies are beginning to try to provide relief for all the peoples of Europe who had been oppressed and whatnot, meaning the starvation and all that. And here's a negotiated surrender. Here they mention right before. So you got a reunion, and then one day, this is the announcement. I won't play the audio, but I'll show you the subs. It was over. General Yodel and Admiral Dunitz. There you go. So that's basically the end of the war, blah, blah, blah. Sort of bittersweet ending because now in the flying line, I thought about using this as my final thumbnail of like right here, as the peoples of being on and seeing the Americans go home, but I figured I thought the image I used was a better option. And of course, at the end, they give you like what happened to all these guys. So that was Masters of the Air. I hope I provided some further context through my reviews of what was going on, which to me is the main thing because the production quality was so good that you're not going to complain about that. I know this episode ran long. I try to hold them to 30 minutes, but there's so much. There's a lot of good stuff. I know I sound down on it, but I enjoyed this series. Okay, I enjoyed the character arcs. I thought it felt like they run. I mean, I wish they'd done more with it. I'm not saying do 3 seasons or whatever. Maybe they could have done a companion series talking about some other stuff. I don't know, but I'm not disappointed. I enjoyed it for what it was, and obviously, how do you rate it? Band of Brothers 10 out of 10. The Pacific Initial like 8 or 9 out of 10. And that's the best way to put it if you want a number. I have some further reading throughout the link. The text below for this episode has all the links for all the episodes. So if you want to copy paste it out and produce the articles at your leisure, and maybe go buy the books this is based on, feel free. I don't get any sort of that. My name is Matt. This has been Unbearable 17's review of Masters of the Air, season 9. I'm not going to do like a final retrospective episode or whatever. I don't think it's needed. I've done so much in depth on these episodes. Comment down below if you have any questions. If you want, I do have some. I could provide some further links for. I'm not a World War II expert. I can't quite answer all your questions in depth, but I can provide you some further resources that I occasionally use to get this info if I don't have it. Right. Like if you like, dislike if you dislike, share this out. Thank you all for listening. Have a great week. I'm out of here.